Your reaction, Senator, was this a 100% success?
Well, only time will tell if it's 100% success. But if we do measure success by the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, Trump certainly does deserve the Peace Prize, because I heard you speak of that on your lead-in.
Yes. I'm also curious about the previous few days, because they've been overshadowed just slightly by all of this news. The G7 at the weekend, your reaction to it and to the kerfuffle between Peter Navarro and then the apology to Justin Trudeau, and what you think might happen trade-wise.
You got a lot of stuff in there. First, the apology was absolutely appropriate. That said, the ties that bind us to Canada and the G7 members are much stronger than harsh words that would occur. I compared it elsewhere to a fight between a spouse. Your spouse, you forget the harsh words, but you work on the underlying issues because you've got a greater goal before of you. What's that greater goal? Well, one, it should be world prosperity, but also American prosperity. After World War II, the United States accepted some trade terms and some conditions that helped us contain the USSR, but the USSR now no longer exists. So perhaps there needs to be a renegotiation, if you will, of those terms and of the underlying assumptions.
I do want to speak a little more about trade, but first, to your agenda, you've got your own plan to lower healthcare costs, and I'm wondering what makes you think that your plan will make it through Congress.
Well, my plan should be bipartisan. It gives the patient the power. Could you imagine one thing is key? Everything we do is price transparency. Could you imagine the doctor orders a CT scan on your daughter's abdomen and you know the price of that CT scan before you go? And by the way, you find someplace just as good that you can get it for a tenth of the cost? Because the cash price does vary by tenfold. And so let's give the patient the power of knowing the price. We think that begins to drive prices down, just as it has done in cell phones and blue jeans. Let's unleash true market forces within healthcare.
There's a slight problem. The Attorney General has told a federal court that, the GOP's tax bill requires nixing protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Will you file an amicus brief on this?
Well, first, let me speak to that. Congress in no way intended for protection for pre-existing conditions to be done away with. And that's pretty clear from all the information that was put out by Republicans at the time of the debate of repealing the individual mandate. That said, the Affordable Care Act or the Unaffordable Care Act is not sustainable. In Louisiana, a guy who's 60 years old with his family not getting a subsidy will pay $50,000 after taxes on insurance that does not completely kick in until he spent $50,000. That is not sustainable for the family or for our nation. Susan Collins and I put forward a bill that would address pre-existing conditions, giving states flexibility to address it, and help that family in Louisiana that's paying so much. Unfortunately, Democrats rejected it literally before they read the bill, but we might bring it back up once more.
Senator Cassidy, clearly something you're very passionate about. I wanted to just switch it back to trade if we can. It's something that I know many German automakers are very passionate about. Are you concerned that we might see further tariffs expand beyond metals into the auto sector? Is this policy that you would like to see, or are you concerned about?
I'm very concerned about it. We have to preserve American jobs. Louisiana, we have three of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage. And so we have a positive balance of trade with the rest of the world. So there has to be, as we readjust, how do we make sure that we don't cost a lot of American jobs or international jobs as we do the readjustment? Ideally, as the president says, every nation works towards lower tariffs. And that would include automobiles without having to go into a trade war. Now, as it turns out, if the tariffs are working for you, you may not want to give in to the United States. And I think that's where the president feels like he needs a little bit of a stick as well as a carrot.
Do you think the stick could end up with a trade war, though, more broadly?
Yeah, it could. So far, the other countries have been probably responding on like measure. We have tariffs on steel, so China puts tariffs on motorcycles and on bourbon, which happen to come from Kentucky and Wisconsin, which happens to be Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan's home states. So far it's been kind of commensurate. Ideally, if we're speaking of China, for example, they would lower their tariffs and their non-tariff trade barriers to allow us to have freer access to their markets. That's the way I'd like to see it play, as opposed to what they're doing, which is kind of a mercantilistic policy, tilting the trade table towards China away from the American worker.
So I'm curious as to what you think about Bob Corker's plan, congressional approval for tariffs. I mean, do you think some Republicans are opposed to that plan because they're afraid it might upset President Trump?
There might be some consideration, but the U.S. Constitution clearly puts trade issues under the legislative, under Congress. And in 1958, Congress ceded some of that to the president, but under our Constitution, it should be with Congress. And so I haven't seen what Corker's put up yet, but if it merely does what the Constitution says should be the norm, which is to return that trade power back to Congress, I would be for that.